It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and the large living room was filled with the chatter of friends and family. The long table was covered with vibrant decorations, balloons, streamers, and colorful confetti that shimmered under the soft lighting. The smell of delicious food filled the air, and the centerpiece of it all was a beautifully decorated cake sitting on a nearby table. It was Angela's birthday, and she had worked hard to make sure everything was perfect for this special day. Angela was an energetic woman who loved celebrating life, and today was no exception. She had spent weeks planning the party, picking out the decorations, and making sure all the guests were taken care of. From the moment the first guest arrived, she had been on her feet, greeting everyone with a warm smile, making small talk, and ensuring that the music played just the right songs. Mark, her husband, stood at the side, quieter than usual, but supportive in his own way. He didn't enjoy the big crowds as much as Angela did, but he knew how much she loved hosting these gatherings. He often stepped into the background, allowing her to shine as the center of attention. The two of them made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Angela was the life of the party, and Mark was the calm, reliable presence that kept things running smoothly. The guests were enjoying themselves, chatting and laughing. Drinks were being served, and the food had been prepared just as Angela had envisioned. People admired the cake, rich chocolate frosting with delicate piping around the edges and fresh fruit on top, looking like it had come from a professional bakery. Angela beamed proudly, knowing it had taken hours to make sure it was just right. But as the day passed, a subtle tension began to build between Angela and Mark. It was nothing obvious at first. Small moments, slight glances, a quiet word here and there began to hint at something unsaid. Angela had noticed it during the party, but she had tried to push it out of her mind, wanting to focus on enjoying the celebration. As the party continued, it came time to settle the bill for the venue, the catering, and the cake. Angela had arranged everything in advance, but now, when it was time to pay, there was an awkward pause. She felt a sudden reluctance, something she hadn't anticipated. Maybe it was the long day or the pressure of making everything perfect. Mark, on the other hand, was expecting everything to go smoothly and wasn't quite sure what was causing Angela's hesitation. The tension was building, slowly at first. Angela hesitated a little longer than usual, trying to figure out how to pay the bill without causing any problems. Mark, sensing the discomfort in the air, started to grow uneasy. He didn't understand why Angela was taking so long. In his mind, the bill was just another part of the day's plans, and it should have been settled already. Angela finally stepped forward to take care of it, but Mark's frustration was starting to show. He thought Angela had everything under control, but the delay had started to unsettle him. What had begun as a joyful celebration was now feeling strained, and neither of them realized that the smallest issue was about to spark something much bigger. The party was still in full swing, but for Angela and Mark, a shift had begun. The evening was far from over, and the next few moments would change everything. The room was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses as guests continued to enjoy themselves. But despite the cheerful atmosphere, Angela could feel the tension starting to grow. She had just stepped up to pay the bill, but for some reason, her mind wasn't at ease. The smile on her face was fading, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she wasn't sure why. Mark, standing a few feet away, watched her with a concerned expression. He had been trying to relax and enjoy the party, but as the evening wore on, he couldn't help but notice that Angela was more distracted than usual. It wasn't like her to hesitate over something as simple as paying the bill, and his patience was beginning to wear thin. He had always been the one who took care of the practical matters, the one who liked to keep things organized. Seeing Angela struggle with this small task was bothering him more than he expected. Angela took out her credit card, but just as she was about to hand it over, she hesitated. There was something holding her back. She looked over at Mark, who was watching her closely. Her heart began to race as she thought about everything that had led up to this moment. The planning, the food, the decorations. Had she really taken care of everything? Was it all enough? Mark's quiet frustration started to grow. "Angela," he said, his voice carrying a hint of impatience, "we've already been through this. Why are you taking so long?" Angela froze. She hadn't expected him to speak so openly about it in front of the guests, and the public nature of the criticism caught her off guard. She turned to him, her face showing signs of both confusion and irritation. "What do you mean?" "I'm just taking care of the bill," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Mark's jaw tightened, and his voice rose just enough to be heard by others. "It's just a bill, Angela. Why are you dragging it out? We planned everything, didn't we?" His words hit Angela harder than she expected. She had worked hard to make this day perfect, and now it felt like Mark was questioning her every move. She tried to stay calm, but a feeling of frustration bubbled up inside her. "I'm doing everything I can," she said quietly. "I just need a minute." But Mark was already irritated. "A minute? You've had enough time. The bill has to be paid, and you're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he snapped. Angela's heart sank. It wasn't just the bill anymore. It felt like there was something deeper between them that was suddenly bubbling to the surface. She looked around at the guests who had fallen silent, unsure of what to do. The conversation that had been so full of laughter just moments ago was now overshadowed by an uncomfortable tension. Mark could feel the eyes of the room on them, but it didn't stop him. His frustration only grew as he saw Angela's hesitation, as if she was somehow deliberately delaying the situation. He couldn't understand why she was acting this way. It wasn't like her. Angela tried to take a deep breath, attempting to stay calm, but her emotions were starting to overwhelm her. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she knew it wasn't the right time to let it explode. But Mark wasn't done yet. "What's going on with you today, Angela?" Mark asked, his voice sharp now. "This was supposed to be a simple day, and you're making it harder than it needs to be." The words stung. Angela's hands began to tremble as she held the card in front of her, ready to pay. But instead of feeling relief, all she could feel was the weight of Mark's criticism. Her smile faltered as she tried to push down the hurt. The room was still quiet. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances but saying nothing. The tension between Angela and Mark was palpable, and the situation was beginning to feel like a time bomb waiting to explode. Angela knew this wasn't the right time for a full conversation, but she could no longer ignore the growing gap between them. She had to respond, to say something. But what? Would it be enough to keep the peace, or was this something bigger than just a simple payment? And in that moment, everything shifted. The cheerful atmosphere was gone. There was no turning back now. What was supposed to be a happy evening was now filled with an uncomfortable silence, and both Angela and Mark knew it was only a matter of time before the truth had to come out. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What was once a lively, fun-filled celebration had now become an uncomfortable gathering. The guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to react as the argument between Angela and Mark continued to grow. Angela stood frozen, her hand still holding the credit card, while Mark's frustration reached a boiling point. Mark's patience had worn thin. Every minute that passed, every second of silence that stretched between them, made him angrier. The other guests were starting to look at them, and he couldn't stand the feeling of being judged. Why couldn't Angela just pay the bill and end this? It was supposed to be simple. Why was she making it more complicated than it needed to be? "Angela." Mark finally exploded, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "What's wrong with you? Why is this taking so long? Just pay the bill already." The sharpness of his voice echoed in the room, and for a moment, everyone fell silent. Angela's face flushed, her heart racing. She had never seen Mark so upset before, and the anger in his tone caught her off guard. The harshness of his words stung more than she had expected. She had been trying to keep her composure, but now, everything felt like it was falling apart. "I'm not trying to make this difficult, Mark," Angela said, her voice trembling but calm. She tried to keep the hurt out of her words, but it was becoming harder with each passing second. I just wanted to make sure everything was handled. I don't know why you're getting so upset. But Mark wasn't listening anymore. He was too caught up in his own frustration, too determined to get the situation over with. You're always doing this. You always make everything harder than it needs to be, he shouted. It's just a bill, Angela. Why can't you just deal with it? Angela's eyes widened as the words hit her. She couldn't believe how Mark was acting. He had never spoken to her like this before, especially not in front of everyone. She had always thought their relationship was built on trust and respect, but right now, all she could feel was the weight of his anger. The room was tense. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Angela's mind raced. Was this really happening? Was this how Mark truly felt? Without thinking, Mark grabbed the cake from the table. He wasn't thinking clearly. His emotions had taken over, and he didn't know how to stop them. With a burst of anger, he hurled the cake in Angela's direction. Time seemed to slow down as the cake flew through the air. Angela barely had time to react before it hit her. The creamy frosting splattered across her face and dress, the cold cake dripping down her clothes. The room gasped, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The shock of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Angela stood still, the shock of the moment sinking in. She blinked, unable to process what had just happened. The party, the laughter, the celebration, it all seemed so far away now. She felt humiliated and hurt, but she didn't let herself break down. Not yet. Not in front of everyone. Mark stood there, staring at her, his face pale with regret. He hadn't meant to do it, but it had happened, and now he was left standing in the middle of the room, realizing that he had gone too far. I didn't mean to, Mark stammered, his voice shaking with the sudden realization of what he had done. Angela, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. But Angela didn't let him finish. She wiped the cake off her face, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, in a calm but steady voice, Angela spoke. Enough, Mark, she said quietly, her voice full of control. I'm done. The words hung in the air, and Mark's heart sank. He had never seen her like this before. Angela had always been the one to keep things together, to handle everything with grace. But now her calm demeanor was more powerful than his anger. She was no longer the woman who would let things slide. She was standing up for herself in a way he hadn't expected. The room remained still as Angela turned away from him, taking a step back. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She was simply done. Done with the chaos. Done with the argument. And done with Mark's outburst. And as the room filled with the hushed whispers of the guests, everyone knew that something had shifted between the couple. This wasn't just about a cake anymore. This was about something much deeper, something that would take time to understand and heal. But for now, Angela had taken the first step toward finding peace in the midst of the storm. The room was still. No one spoke as Angela stood there, frozen, covered in cake. The creamy frosting dripped from her hair and down her dress, while the sweet scent of chocolate hung heavily in the air. The joyful atmosphere of the party, once full of laughter and chatter, had vanished in an instant. It was replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Every guest in the room seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Angela could feel the eyes of the room on her. Some guests whispered to each other. Others sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. The noise from the party had come to an abrupt halt. All that was left was the shocking image of Angela standing there, covered in cake, and Mark standing in front of her, pale and regretful. Angela's heart was racing. She had never imagined that something like this could happen. The argument had started out as a simple disagreement about the bill, but now it had escalated beyond anything she had expected. Mark had always been quiet and controlled, but today his anger had taken over. She didn't know how to feel. Was this a momentary outburst, or was there something deeper beneath the surface? Mark stood there, staring at her, his mouth moving but no words coming out. The shock of what he had just done was written all over his face. He never intended to humiliate her. It had all happened so fast, in the heat of the moment. But the damage had been done. His anger had exploded, and now there was no taking it back. I didn't mean it, Angela," Mark stammered, his voice low and trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't." Angela didn't give him a chance to finish. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, removing the remnants of cake from her skin. She felt the cold frosting smear on her fingers, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the cake that upset her. It was the look in Mark's eyes. The anger, the frustration, the complete lack of control. It was something she had never seen from him before. She finally looked up at him, her eyes cold but composed. The hurt she felt was evident in her expression, but she wasn't going to let herself break down in front of everyone. She had been through too much in her life to let something like this tear her apart. But right now, it was hard to control the emotions bubbling inside her. The silence in the room was unbearable. Angela took a deep breath, her hands still trembling from the shock. She could feel the tears starting to sting her eyes, but she fought them back. This wasn't the time to cry. It wasn't the time to show weakness. She needed to stay strong, even though everything inside her was shattered. "I can't believe you just did that," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "I've never felt so humiliated in my life." Mark's face turned a shade of red as he heard her words. The weight of her pain hit him like a ton of bricks. He wanted to apologize, to take back what he had done, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew that his actions couldn't be undone. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Angela took a step back from him, her body language saying everything that her words couldn't. She didn't want to look at him right now. She didn't want to be near him. The trust she had placed in him was starting to crumble, and she wasn't sure how to rebuild it. "I need some time alone," Angela said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to think about everything." Without waiting for Mark to respond, she turned and walked toward the door. She didn't want to see anyone right now, not even her closest friends. She needed space to breathe, to process everything that had just happened. As Angela stepped out of the room, the silence continued. No one dared to speak, but everyone knew that things had changed between the couple. The party that was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a moment of reflection for everyone involved. Mark stood still, staring at the spot where Angela had been moments before. He could feel the regret building up inside him, but it wasn't enough. He knew that saying sorry wouldn't fix what he had done. The damage was done, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his life, Mark was uncertain. He had lost control, and he had hurt the one person who meant the most to him. Now he had to figure out how to make things right. But the question was, would Angela ever be able to forgive him? The silence in the room felt heavy, like a thick cloud that no one knew how to move. The guests shifted awkwardly in their seats, unsure of what to do or say. No one had ever seen Mark act this way before. He had always been the calm one in their relationship, the one who kept things balanced. But today, that calmness had shattered. The atmosphere that had once been warm and inviting was now clouded by tension. Mark stood motionless, staring at Angela as she walked out of the room. His mind raced, but his body felt frozen. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His outburst, throwing the cake, had been a moment of anger that he didn't know how to control. He had let his frustration boil over, and now he had hurt the one person he loved the most. As the seconds passed, the awkwardness in the room began to grow. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to leave or stay. Some of them had known Angela and Mark for years and had never seen them argue so openly. Others, who were just acquaintances, looked at each other in confusion, unsure if they should intervene or remain silent. In the midst of the silence, one of the guests, a close friend of Angela's, finally stood up. Her name was Sarah, and she had known Angela for years. Sarah wasn't the type to stay quiet when things weren't right. She had seen Angela go through difficult times before, and she wasn't about to let this moment go unnoticed. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm, "what just happened here? You can't treat Angela like that, especially in front of everyone." Mark glanced at Sarah, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't know how to explain what had happened, how to apologize for what he had done. The weight of his actions sat heavily on his chest, and the room seemed to grow colder with each passing second. "I didn't mean to do it, Sarah," Mark finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost control, and I didn't know how to stop. I'm sorry." Sarah crossed her arms, her expression stern. "Sorry isn't enough, Mark. You can't just throw cake at someone and expect it to be okay. Angela didn't deserve that. No one deserves that." The other guests were now looking at Mark, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They had never seen him like this before. Angela had always been the one to keep things together, to make everything feel right. But now Mark had thrown that all away with one impulsive decision. He had hurt Angela in a way that would take time to heal. Mark felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He knew Sarah was right. He had done something unforgivable, and there was nothing he could say to make it right immediately. All he wanted was to fix it, to make Angela understand that this wasn't who he was, but he knew it wasn't that simple. "Where is she?" Mark finally asked, his voice shaking. "I need to talk to her. I have to make things right." Sarah shook her head. "She needs time, Mark. You can't just rush in and fix things. You've hurt her, and you need to respect that. Give her the space she needs." Mark stood there, feeling a mix of helplessness and regret. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle any situation. He had been the one people turned to for advice, the one who kept things steady. But today he had lost control, and now he was left picking up the pieces of a situation he couldn't fix with a simple apology. As the guests slowly began to leave, the tension still lingered in the air. Mark remained behind, standing in the middle of the room, his mind replaying every moment of the argument, every word he had said, and every move he had made. He knew that what had just happened wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. He didn't know how to fix it, but he knew he had to try. He had broken something between him and Angela, and now he would have to prove that he was willing to do whatever it took to make it right. But first, he had to give her the space she needed. He couldn't rush the healing process. He had to wait, hope that she would be willing to listen to him again when the time was right. Angela sat alone in the quiet room, her mind racing. She hadn't gone far, just into their bedroom, where she could take a moment to breathe. She leaned against the door and closed her eyes, trying to push the events of the evening out of her mind. But it wasn't easy. Mark's words still echoed in her head, and the shock of what had just happened weighed heavily on her. She had never imagined this moment. Yes, she and Mark had their disagreements, like any couple, but they had always found a way to talk things through. They communicated, even when things were difficult. But today, everything had changed. The man she thought she knew so well had done something completely out of character. The anger, the loss of control, it wasn't something she could easily forget. Angela could still feel the cake on her skin, the cold frosting dripping down her dress. But it wasn't just the mess that upset her. It was the feeling of betrayal, of being humiliated in front of their friends. She had worked so hard to make this day perfect for both of them, but in an instant, Mark had ruined it. As she sat on the bed, her thoughts were clouded with a mixture of emotions. She was angry, hurt, and confused. She wanted to confront him, to tell him how wrong he was, but she also knew that doing so right now wouldn't solve anything. She needed time to process what had happened. She needed time for herself. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. It was a text message from Sarah, her close friend who had witnessed everything. "I'm here for you, Angela. Don't let this define your day. You deserve respect." Angela read the message twice before placing the phone back down. She appreciated Sarah's support, but she wasn't sure how to move forward. How could she go back to the way things were? How could she trust Mark again after what he had done? Mark hadn't even come to check on her yet. She could hear the soft hum of the party outside, but Mark wasn't with the guests anymore. He had probably retreated to his thoughts, just like she had, but he hadn't come to apologize or even see if she was okay. Was he too embarrassed, or was he trying to avoid facing what he had done? For a long time, Angela sat in the quiet room, contemplating everything. The hurt she felt was deep, but the frustration ran even deeper. Mark had always been someone she looked up to, someone who never let his emotions get the best of him. But now, she didn't know who he was anymore. Finally, after what felt like hours, Angela heard a light knock on the door. It was tentative, almost uncertain. She didn't have to ask who it was. "Angela." Mark's voice came softly through the door. She took a deep breath before answering. "I'm fine, Mark. You can go back to the party." There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice strained. "I can't, Angela. I've made a mess of everything. I can't just pretend nothing happened. I'm so sorry for what I did." Angela stood up and opened the door slowly, finding Mark standing on the other side, his face full of regret. He was standing with his shoulders slumped, his eyes not meeting hers. It was clear that he was struggling. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Angela. I don't know what came over me," Mark said, his voice full of guilt. Angela looked at him for a moment, her mind still processing the apology. She could see that he was sorry, but the damage had already been done. She needed him to understand that words alone wouldn't fix what had happened. He couldn't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. "I know you didn't mean to," Angela said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "But you did. You hurt me, Mark. And it's not just about the cake. It's about how you lost control. It's about how you disrespected me." Mark's eyes filled with sadness. He took a step forward, but Angela held up her hand, signaling that she needed space. She needed time to think. "I need time, Mark," she said firmly. "I need time to process everything that's happened. I need time for myself." Mark nodded slowly, his face full of understanding. He knew he couldn't rush her forgiveness. He had crossed a line, and he would have to live with the consequences. "I'll give you all the time you need," Mark said quietly. "I just want you to know that I'm here when you're ready to talk." Angela closed the door gently as he stepped away, leaving her alone in the room once more. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. This moment, this decision, was going to shape the future of their relationship, and only time would tell if they could rebuild what had been broken. The night stretched on, but Angela couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in her mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers lightly brushing the fabric of her dress, still stained from the cake. The mess had been cleaned up, but the emotional mess that had been left behind was harder to erase. She could hear the faint sounds of the party still going on outside the room, the laughter and chatter of friends and family filling the house, but all of it felt distant now. The once joyful celebration had turned into something unrecognizable. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Angela looked up. She knew who it was. She had been expecting this moment, even though she wasn't sure how to face it. She had been waiting for Mark to come to her, to say the words that would bring some kind of closure to the night. He had to face what he had done, but she didn't know if she was ready to hear his apology, or if it would even be enough. "Angela." Mark's voice was low, tinged with uncertainty. She didn't respond immediately. Part of her wanted to stay quiet, to shut him out, but she knew that wouldn't help. Instead, she took a deep breath and stood up, walking to the door. She opened it slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since everything had happened. Mark stood there, his shoulders slumped in guilt. His eyes were soft, filled with regret. He looked like a man who was struggling to find the right words, and Angela could see how torn he was inside. He wanted to make it right. She could see that. But was it enough? Could words fix this? "I'm so sorry, Angela," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what happened. I lost control. I never should have treated you like that. You didn't deserve it. I hurt you, and I hate myself for it." "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," Angela replied quietly. "But you did. And it wasn't just the cake. It was how you lost control. How you treated me in front of everyone. I felt humiliated, Mark. Not just because of what happened, but because of how quickly you let your anger take over." Mark's face softened, and he took a step closer. He didn't reach out for her, knowing she needed space. "I can't even begin to imagine how I made you feel," he admitted. "I've always been the one who tries to stay calm, the one who handles things without getting emotional. But that moment, I just snapped. I don't know why. I hate that I hurt you, Angela. I'm so sorry." Angela nodded, her heart heavy. She could see how much he regretted it, but there was still something inside her that felt unsettled. The pain of the moment wasn't something that could be erased in a few words. It was going to take time for her to heal. "I know you're sorry," she said softly, "but sorry doesn't fix everything. It doesn't take away how I feel right now. It doesn't erase the hurt, and it doesn't make me forget what happened. I need time, Mark. I need time to think about everything about us." Mark's eyes filled with understanding, and he nodded slowly. "I get it. I really do. You don't have to forgive me right away. I'll give you all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I can be better. I don't want this to be the end of us." Angela took another deep breath, her emotions still raw, but slowly starting to calm. She knew this wasn't the end, but it was a turning point. She wasn't sure where their relationship would go from here, but she knew it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been broken. She had to protect herself, but she also wanted to give Mark the chance to prove he could change. "Thank you for understanding," she said quietly. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I need time to figure it out. And I need you to respect that. I need to be able to think without feeling like I'm being pressured." "I will," Mark promised, his voice sincere. "I'll give you all the space you need. I'm not going anywhere. I just need you to know that I'm truly sorry, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes." With those words, Angela stepped back, giving him the space he had promised. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the incident, she felt like she had some control over the situation. The path forward would take time, but it was one they would have to walk together, at their own pace. "Good night, Mark," Angela said softly, her voice steady. "Good night, Angela," Mark replied, his eyes filled with both regret and hope. As Angela closed the door behind her, she let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she was certain of one thing. She needed to take care of herself first, and for now, that meant giving herself the time to heal. The next few days were quiet. Angela spent much of her time alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. She didn't rush into decisions. Instead, she allowed herself the space she needed to think clearly. Mark had given her the time she asked for, respecting her wishes and remaining patient. He sent occasional texts to check in, each one more apologetic than the last, but Angela had not responded right away. She wasn't ready yet. She needed to find clarity in her own heart before she could speak to him again. It wasn't just the cake or the argument that had shaken her. It was the way she felt about herself in that moment. She had always believed in their relationship in Mark, but now she was unsure. Could they go back to the way things were? Would she ever feel safe with him again? One evening, as the sun was setting, Angela sat on the porch with a cup of tea, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The air was cool, and the world around her seemed still, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She had always been strong, independent, and able to handle challenges with grace. But this moment, this situation, was different. It wasn't just a simple argument. It had reached deep into her sense of self-respect and trust. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Mark. He had come over, as he had so many times before, but this time felt different. His presence at the door didn't carry the usual comfort. She could tell he was anxious, his face pale, and his eyes full of hope, but also fear. "Angela." His voice was soft, almost hesitant. She took a deep breath before answering. "I'm here, Mark. Come in." He stepped inside, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of how she was feeling. Angela had always been open with him, but right now she wasn't sure how to express everything that had been building inside her. "Thank you for letting me in," Mark said quietly. "I know I've been sending messages, but I wanted to see you, to talk. I've been thinking about everything, about what I did, and I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry." Angela nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She knew he was sorry, but the apology alone wasn't enough. She needed more than that now. She needed to hear that he understood the weight of his actions, that he recognized how deeply he had shaken her trust. "Mark, I've been thinking too," Angela began, her voice calm but firm. "And I need to be honest with you about where I am right now." Mark's eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer, but Angela held up her hand to stop him. "I don't want to rush into anything," she continued, "but I've made a decision. I need some time, not just away from you, but for myself. I need to figure out what I want, what I deserve, and I can't do that with the pressure of trying to make things go back to normal." Mark's face fell, the hope that had been in his eyes dimming. He opened his mouth to speak, but Angela raised her hand again, signaling that she wasn't done. "I'm not saying this is the end, Mark. I'm saying I need to breathe. I need space to think clearly about everything. I need to understand what's best for me, whether it's with you or not. I've lost a part of myself in all of this, and I can't move forward until I find it again." Mark stood still, processing her words. He had expected this in a way. He knew that the road to forgiveness and healing would not be easy, and right now, he had to accept the truth of what she was saying. He was willing to give her the space she needed, even if it hurt. "Okay," Mark said, his voice breaking slightly. "I understand. I won't push you. I just hope you know that no matter what you decide, I love you, and I will be here for you when you're ready." Angela felt a mixture of relief and sadness. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. She needed to take this time for herself, to reconnect with who she was and what she wanted. The uncertainty of the future was difficult, but she knew it was something she had to face head-on. "I'll be in touch, Mark," she said softly, her voice steady. "Take care of yourself." With that, Mark nodded and walked out of the room, leaving Angela alone once again. As she watched him leave, a sense of calm washed over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, she felt like she had taken control of her life again. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The days after Angela's decision were filled with a quiet intensity that Mark hadn't expected. He had agreed to give her space, but the silence between them felt heavy. He had never been the type to sit still with his emotions for long, and now he found himself confronting a side of himself he hadn't really understood until this moment. He spent the next few days alone, reflecting on what Angela had said. He had been so focused on his anger in that moment, throwing the cake, losing his temper, that he hadn't taken the time to understand the impact of his actions. Angela's words echoed in his mind. He needed to think about himself, about what he had done, and about whether he could change. Mark had always been someone who prided himself on keeping things under control. He rarely let his emotions get the best of him. But now, sitting alone in their home, he realized how much he had been taking for granted. He had expected everything to stay the same, without considering how his behavior had affected Angela or their relationship. She had always been there for him, always understanding. But now, that trust was broken, and he had to face the reality of what he had done. It wasn't easy. Every time he thought about the moment he had lost control, he could feel the shame rise in his chest. He had hurt the person he loved the most, and there was no quick fix for that. He knew that apologies weren't enough. Not when the damage was this deep. It would take time. And he had to be patient, not just with Angela, but with himself as well. The next few days passed slowly. Mark took up a few old hobbies he hadn't indulged in for a while. Reading, walking through the park, and even going back to work on a project he had left unfinished. But none of these things seemed to fill the space left by Angela's absence. The house felt quieter without her, and he realized how much of his life had been tied to their shared routine. It was hard to admit, but he missed her in ways he hadn't understood before. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, Mark took out his phone and typed a message to Angela. He wasn't sure if she would respond, but he knew he needed to reach out. "I've been thinking a lot. I know I've hurt you, and I can't change what happened, but I'm learning from it. I won't rush anything, but when you're ready, I'd like to talk." He hesitated for a moment before hitting send. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was sincere. He wanted to show Angela that he was willing to make the effort to change. He couldn't promise that things would go back to the way they were immediately, but he could promise that he would work hard to rebuild the trust they had lost. A few hours later, he received a response from Angela. He didn't know what he had expected, but reading her words gave him a sense of peace. "I appreciate your message, Mark. I'm still taking time for myself, but I can see that you're trying. We can talk soon, when I'm ready." Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was a start. It was a sign that Angela was open to the possibility of healing, even if it would take time. The next day, Mark enrolled in a counseling program. He realized that his anger had deeper roots, and he needed to understand himself better to avoid repeating his mistakes. He was determined to be a better partner, not just for Angela, but for himself too. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to put in the work. Over the next few weeks, Mark continued his therapy, finding small ways to grow. He became more patient with himself, acknowledging his flaws without beating himself up. Every small step was a reminder that change was possible, that he didn't have to stay stuck in old patterns. Meanwhile, Angela took her time to reflect on her own feelings. She needed to know if she could trust Mark again, if they could build something new together. The process wasn't fast, but it was steady. And when they finally spoke again, both of them had changed in ways they hadn't expected. They had learned to face the difficult parts of their relationship with honesty and patience. While the road ahead was still uncertain, it was clear that they were both willing to walk it together, one step at a time. Mark had learned that real growth wasn't just about fixing mistakes. It was about understanding them and making a conscious effort to do better. And that, in the end, was what would help him rebuild the trust he had lost and move forward with Angela by his side.